In May of 2024, Andrew Huberman welcomed Dr. James Hollis, a Jungian analyst with over 17 books on deep psychology, to his podcast. For nearly 2 hours, they unraveled something that Jung mapped out a century ago, something that neuroscience is now confirming with irrefutable evidence. Highly empathetic people, empaths, almost magnetically attract individuals who secretly hate the light they carry, and it's no coincidence. It's a psychological and neurobiological mechanism, so precise it can be measured on MRI scans. If you've ever wondered why, the more you evolve spiritually, the more resistance you encounter, often disguised as friendship, the next few minutes will reveal the truth that academia often tries to sugarcoat. There's a concept that Jung called shadow projection. The shadow, for Jung, is everything you deny in yourself, your undeveloped parts, your repressed capabilities, your stifled talents. And here's the crux of the matter. When you, as an empath, develop these capabilities, when you shine, when you access your genuine inner light, you become a living mirror for those who've buried their own. You're not doing anything wrong. You're simply being what they didn't have the courage to be. And that generates an envy so profound, they don't even admit to feeling it, not even to themselves. In that episode with Hollis, Huberman posed a direct question: how do we recognize the shadow in others? Hollis's answer was devastating. You recognize it by the disproportionate emotional intensity. When someone reacts with excessive hostility to your achievement, your peace, your evolution, it's not about you, it's about their shadow that you're activating unintentionally, and neuroscience proves it. In August of 2024, Huberman hosted Bill Eddy, an expert on high-conflict individuals, including narcissists. Eddy revealed that narcissists have a neurobiological deficit of empathy. Their mirror neurons, the brain cells responsible for feeling what others feel, are less active. Meanwhile, empaths have hyper-responsive mirror neurons, your neurological opposites. And when you meet, the dynamics are predictable. You feel too much. They feel too little. You illuminate. They project. Jung said something that seems cruel at first glance, but it's liberating once you understand it. He said that our capacity for envy, for aggression, for destructiveness, is part of the shadow of us all. No one is immune, but conscious people recognize these tendencies in themselves and integrate them. Unconscious people project these tendencies onto whoever is shining, and then the disguised attack begins. Have you ever had a friend who praised you, but always with a barb, who celebrated your victories, but quickly changed the subject? Who said they supported you, but were never available when you needed them? Who minimized your suffering by saying other people have it worse? That's not friendship. It's shadow projection, disguised as closeness. Hollis said on the podcast that typical shadow issues include our capacity for jealousy, envy, aggression, and greed. And the only way to deal with these aspects is by bringing them to awareness. But most people don't do that. It's easier to project onto you. You become the target because you're visible, because you're active, because you're alive, in a way that they are not. Now comes the disturbing part. Huberman explains that the mirror neuron system isn't just about empathy. It also regulates social comparison. When a person with an empathy deficit, like a narcissist, sees someone with superior emotional capabilities, their brain registers it as a threat to their own identity. And the neurobiological response isn't admiration, it's unconscious resentment. A study that Huberman mentioned in other episodes on mirror neurons shows that highly empathetic people activate brain areas associated with pleasure when they see someone happy. Narcissists, on the other hand, activate areas associated with pain. They literally feel pain when they see you happy. This isn't poetic exaggeration. It's activation of the left anterior insula, a region of the brain linked to physical and emotional discomfort. Jung called it the poison of envy. He said that envy is one of the most destructive emotions because it cannot be satisfied. When someone envies your light, there's no amount of validation you can give to appease them, because the problem isn't what you have or what you do. The problem is what they haven't developed in themselves. And here's the complete mechanism. You, as an empath, have hyperactive mirror neurons. This means you deeply feel the emotions of the people around you. You literally absorb emotional states. When you encounter someone with an unintegrated shadow, you feel their dissonance. And because you're an empath, you try to help, you try to illuminate, you try to show the way. But what happens? They project even more. Because your attempt to help becomes a painful reminder of what they're not doing for themselves. Huberman said something crucial in the episode with Hollis. He asked, "What's the biggest resistance people have to doing the inner work, to facing the shadow?" Hollis responded, fear. Fear that when they look inside, they'll discover they're terrible, that they're unworthy, that they're empty. And so they prefer to project those feelings onto you. You become the terrible one. You become the empty one. You become the problem. Jung went even deeper. He said that when a person manages to look at their own shadow and recognize it, they now have a big problem, because they can no longer blame others for what goes wrong in their life. And that, for most people, is unbearable. It's easier to keep blaming you. Do you see the pattern? Empaths attract shadow projectors because you're the perfect target. You're visible, you're emotionally responsive, you try to understand, you give the benefit of the doubt, and while you're trying to illuminate, they're using your light to confirm their own self-imposed darkness. There's a phrase that Hollis said on the podcast that is devastating in its simplicity. Projection is a defense mechanism where individuals attribute unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or qualities to others. This helps people avoid recognizing these characteristics within themselves and to distance themselves from uncomfortable aspects of their own personality. Translating that further, when someone criticizes you for being dramatic, it's because they've repressed their own drama. When someone accuses you of being selfish for taking care of yourself, it's because they've never allowed themselves to care for themselves. When someone minimizes your spiritual evolution, it's because they've given up on their own. Now, why isn't this taught openly? Why is the connection between Jung and Huberman often softened in academic circles? Because admitting this creates a huge social problem. If you accept that shadow projection is real and neurobiologically verifiable, you have to admit that a huge part of human relationships are based on unconscious projections. You have to admit that many people don't love you for who you are, but hate you for what you represent to their shadow. And there's more. If you accept that narcissists have neurobiological empathy deficits, you disarm the entire narrative that everyone can change if they just try. Some people can't. Not because they're evil, but because their brains literally don't process empathy the same way. And for an empath with hyperactive mirror neurons, that truth is painful. Because you want to believe that everyone can awaken. Carl Jung knew this. That's why he said that the greatest psychological burden a person can carry is living a life unlived. And when you, as an empath, live fully, when you integrate your shadow, when you shine, you become a walking reminder of that burden for those who've chosen not to live. James Hollis explained that when you bring the shadow into consciousness and integrate it, you no longer need external scapegoats. You take full responsibility for your psychic life, but to do that, you need brutal courage. Courage to admit that you have the capacity for envy, for pettiness, for cruelty. And when you admit that and integrate it, you stop projecting. You stop using others as distorted mirrors, but most people don't do it. It's easier to continue in automatic mode. And the automatic mode of the unintegrated shadow is to find someone who is shining and try to extinguish that light, not in an obvious way, but in a subtle way. Passive-aggressive comments, lack of support in crucial moments, superficial celebration followed by emotional distancing. Andrew Huberman, in the episode about mirror neurons, explained that when you see someone doing something, your mirror neurons internally simulate that action. It's as if you were doing it too. For empaths, that simulation is intense. But when an empath sees someone suffering, the mirror neurons create internal suffering as well, and then you try to alleviate it. You try to help. But when you're dealing with someone who projects their shadow, your attempt to help is interpreted as arrogance, because you're showing that it's possible to do what they aren't doing. You're proving that change is possible, and that's an existential threat to their ego. Carl Jung used to say that the ego has very sophisticated defense mechanisms to avoid transformation, and projection is one of the most effective, because while you're projecting, you don't need to change. You can continue being who you've always been, but now, with the justification that the problem is out there, and you, as an empath, fall into that trap. You internalize the projection. You start to doubt yourself. Am I being too dramatic? Am I being selfish for prioritizing my well-being? Am I being arrogant for celebrating my accomplishments? No. You're being used as a projection screen. James Hollis said something powerful. He said that you have to learn to differentiate between real guilt, which comes from genuine ethical transgressions, and projected guilt, which comes from other people trying to make you carry their shadow. Empaths are especially vulnerable to this, because their mirror neurons make you feel empathetic guilt, even when you haven't done anything wrong. Now, how do you get out of this cycle? How do you stop attracting shadow projectors? Carl Jung and Andrew Huberman, each in their own way, point to the same solution: integration of your own shadow. Carl Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Empaths who haven't integrated their own shadow attract projectors because they're still operating from unconscious patterns. You believe that you always need to be available. You believe that you need to prove your worth by being helpful. You believe that love means infinite self-sacrifice. These beliefs come from your unintegrated shadow, the part of you that was conditioned to be the healer, the savior, the emotionally available one. But when you integrate that part and recognize that it's a survival strategy, not an identity, you stop operating from that place. You stop attracting people who need saviors because you stop offering yourself in that role. Andrew Huberman explains this neurologically. When you change behavioral patterns consistently, you rewrite neural circuits through neuroplasticity. If you've always responded available when someone calls you, your brain's circuits associate proximity with immediate availability. But if you start to establish boundaries, to say no, to prioritize your own well-being, you create new circuits, and that changes who you attract. Because people who operate by shadow projection look for predictable targets. They look for who will absorb, who will try to understand, who will give infinite chances. When you stop being that target, they will go somewhere else. But hold on, because what I'm about to reveal now is the protocol that unites the deep psychology of Carl Jung with the neuroscience of Andrew Huberman, and that can free you from this cycle of magnetic attraction of shadow projectors. James Hollis explained that working with the shadow isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. Wholeness, he said, is the integration of opposites. You don't eliminate the capacity for envy, for anger, for selfishness. You recognize that these capacities exist and bring them into consciousness. And then you consciously choose how and when to use those energies. Andrew Huberman added a practical dimension to this vision. He asked James Hollis, how does someone do this inner work? James Hollis responded with something simple, but revolutionary. Daily reflective journaling. Every night, before sleeping, you write down 3 questions. Where today did I project onto someone something that is mine? Where today did I avoid emotional responsibility? Where today did I live from my true self and not from the persona that I built to please others? That seems too simple to work, but neurologically, what you're doing is activating the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for self-reflection and emotional regulation. When you write by hand, you activate motor regions that strengthen memory consolidation. When you do this consistently every night, you create a feedback loop that turns unconscious into conscious. Andrew Huberman has a protocol about this that he calls deliberate reflection, setting aside 10 minutes before bed to process the day without screen, without distraction, just you, a notebook, and 3 profound questions. He's done this for years, and he says it's completely changed how he processes interpersonal relationships. But there's a part of the protocol that's even more powerful. Carl Jung called it confronting the shadow. Andrew Huberman calls it controlled exposure to emotional discomfort. They're both talking about the same thing. You need to consciously place yourself in situations where your unconscious patterns are going to be activated, and then observe, without reacting. For example, you know you tend to become emotionally hypervigilant when someone criticizes you. Your pattern is to immediately try to understand the other person's perspective and adjust yourself. That's your unintegrated empath pattern. The protocol is, the next time someone criticizes you, you don't respond immediately. You breathe. You observe the sensation in your body. You name internally what you're feeling. Anxiety in your chest. Need to explain. Impulse to appease. And then you consciously choose not to act from that pattern. You say something simple. I'll think about that. Or even, I disagree, without explanation or without justification, without trying to make the other person feel better about your response. This is shadow integration in action, because you're bringing into awareness the automatic pattern of emotional self-sacrifice that makes you a target for projectors, and you're choosing differently, neurologically. What happens is fascinating. Huberman explains that when you break an established behavioral pattern, you create temporary discomfort in the neural networks that support that pattern. But if you tolerate the discomfort, without going back to the old pattern, you force the brain to create new connections. That's directed neuroplasticity. And here is the perfect parallel with Carl Jung. Jung said that psychological transformation is always accompanied by anxiety. Because you're killing an old version of yourself, to be born a new one. And the ego resists this with all its might. It prefers the familiarity of known suffering than the uncertainty of unknown transformation. But when you use the joint protocol, when you combine Jungian reflection with Huberman's neuroplasticity, you have a complete tool. Every night, reflective journaling, identifying projections and patterns during the day, deliberate exposure to situations that activate your patterns, but choosing to respond differently. There's a third element that James Hollis mentioned, and that Huberman had already talked about in other episodes: conscious community. Jung created analysis groups where people did shadow work collectively, because when you witness someone recognizing their own shadow with courage, you feel permission to do the same. And when you're surrounded by people who are integrating, not projecting, you stop attracting projectors. Huberman calls this social shaping of neural behavior. Your brain adapts patterns based on who you spend the most time with. If you're always with people who project, who blame, who avoid responsibility, your mirror neurons will mimic those tendencies. But if you're with people who do inner work, who recognize patterns, who integrate shadow, you naturally start to do the same. Carl Jung said that individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, is never done alone. It's always in relation, but it has to be in relation with people who are on the same path, not with people who want to use you as a projection screen. And here comes a revelation that may be difficult to hear. If you're constantly attracting people who secretly hate your light, the question isn't why are they like that? The question is, why do you continue to be available to receive those projections? Hollis said on the podcast that the biggest insight someone can have is realizing that you're perpetuating the very patterns that make you suffer. Not because you're a masochist, but because those patterns are familiar. They were how you survived in childhood. Being the available empath, the healer, the understanding one, kept you safe at some point. But now, in adulthood, those same patterns make you vulnerable to projectors. Huberman explains this in terms of neural conditioning, patterns that were reinforced repeatedly during the developmental years create neural superhighways. It's much easier for the brain to follow the superhighway than to create a new path. So even when you know rationally that you should establish boundaries, that you should step away from projectors, that you should prioritize your well-being, you go back to the OLD patterns, because neurologically, it's the path of least resistance. But the good news is, neuroplasticity allows you to create new paths. It's not quick, it's not easy, but it's possible. You need consistent repetition of the new behavior. Hollis recommends 90 days of daily practice to start seeing real changes. Huberman says that significant neuroplastic changes take between 60 and 90 days of deliberate practice. So the complete protocol is 90 days of reflective journaling every night with 3 questions about projection, emotional responsibility, and authenticity. 90 days of deliberate exposure to situations that activate old patterns, but choosing to respond in a new way. 90 days of intentionally surrounding yourself with people who do inner work, not people who project. Seems like a lot? It is. But the alternative is continuing to be a magnetic target for people who secretly hate your light. For the rest of your life, Jung said that there is no illumination in imagining figures of light, but in making the darkness conscious. The work is with your own shadow first. And when you integrate your shadow, when you stop operating from unconscious patterns, you automatically stop attracting those who operate by projection. There's a phrase that Hollis said that summarizes everything. The question isn't, who am I? The question is, who do I need to stop being to become who I really am? For empaths, the answer is clear. You need to stop being the available savior, the automatic healer, the infinitely understanding one. These are not your essence. They are survival strategies that became identity. When you release those strategies, when you integrate the shadow that contains your ability to say no, to prioritize your well-being, to let people carry their own burdens, you stop being a target. You become whole. And whole people don't attract projectors, because projectors seek fragments, not totality. You've just discovered why empaths attract people who secretly hate their light. In the last few minutes, you saw the deep connection between Jung's shadow projection and Huberman's mirror neurons. You understood that it's not about you being too bright. It's about them not having the courage to face their own darkness. This truth was validated by Dr. James Hollis. On the May 2024 episode of the Huberman Lab, where he explained exactly how envy is born from the unintegrated shadow. This truth was confirmed by Bill Eddy in an episode from August 2024, where he unveiled the neurobiological deficit of empathy in narcissists. And this truth is being suppressed by academia, because admitting it means admitting that a large portion of human relationships are unconscious games of shadow projection. Few channels have the courage to unite Carl Jung and Andrew Huberman in this way, because when you do, you reveal that protocols without psychological depth are just neurobiological band-aids. You reveal that neuroscience without ancient wisdom is incomplete, and that bothers both the protocol people, who think everything can be solved with sunlight and ice baths, and the mystics, who believe neuroscience is reductionist. But the truth lies in integration. Carl Jung drew the map of the psyche. Andrew Huberman is translating it into neural language. And when you unite both, you have real power for transformation. The super thanks isn't just financial support. It's you saying that this synthesis needs to continue being revealed, that you want more connections between deep psychology and modern neuroscience. When you click that golden heart, you're funding the next revelation that the Academy is trying to hide. You're not a passive spectator, you're a researcher of truth. Be a part of those who unite ancient wisdom with modern science. Be part of those who have the courage to face the shadow instead of projecting it. Now, let me give you the final revelation that changes everything about how you'll view your relationships moving forward. The deepest reason why empaths attract shadow projectors isn't because you are victims. It's because you haven't yet completed the individuation process. Carl Jung said that individuation is the process of becoming indivisible, singular, unique. It's you becoming who you really are, not who you were conditioned to be. And most empaths are stuck in the first half of the individuation process. You've developed emotional sensitivity, compassion, the ability to feel deeply. That's wonderful. But you haven't developed the other half, discernment. Clear boundaries, the ability to say no without guilt, healthy prioritization of your own well-being. That second half lives in your shadow because you were taught that these qualities are selfish, cold, insensitive, so you repress them. And as long as those qualities are repressed, you'll continue to attract people who will exploit your light because you're not yet complete. You're still a fragment, not a totality. Andrew Huberman explains that the brain operates by energy economy. It seeks patterns that have worked in the past, and if in the past, being the available empath gave you love, validation, a sense of purpose, your brain will continue seeking situations where you can repeat that pattern, even if those situations hurt you now. But when you integrate the shadow, when you bring to consciousness your capacity to be selective, to be assertive, to prioritize yourself, you break the pattern, and then your brain stops seeking situations of self-sacrifice. It starts seeking reciprocity, mutuality, balance, and people who operate by projection hate balance. Because balance demands that they do their own internal work. It demands that they stop using you as an emotional dumping ground. It demands that they face their own shadow. And most won't do that, so they'll leave. And you'll finally attract people who are on the same level of integration as you. Carl Jung said something profound that Andrew Huberman often cites. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens. Empaths who continue to attract projectors are looking outside, trying to understand the other, trying to heal the other, trying to illuminate the other. But the work isn't out there, it's within. When you look inside and face your own shadow, when you recognize that you also have the capacity for healthy selfishness, for strategic indifference, for necessary detachment, you awaken. And in awakening, you stop being a target. You become whole. And wholeness doesn't attract fragments. Wholeness attracts wholeness. So the final question is, are you going to continue being a fragment and available for projection? Or are you going to have the courage to become whole? The choice has always been yours. Carl Jung has already shown the way. Andrew Huberman validated it with neuroscience. Now it's up to you. Now, I need to know something from you. Have you noticed that the more you grow spiritually, the more certain people secretly resent you? Write in the comments if you've already identified this. And more importantly, tell me, what was the moment you realized that you were being targeted by shadow projection, not genuine love? The more specific you are, the more you validate the experience of other empaths who are going through the same dynamic, and collective validation is the first step to breaking unconscious patterns. Carl Jung drew the map of the psyche. Andrew Huberman translated it into neural GPS. When deep psychology meets neuroscience, awakening is inevitable. You don't have to choose between ancient wisdom and modern science. You integrate both, and in integration, you become whole. And whole people don't attract projectors. They attract other whole people, and that changes everything.